Welcome to Democracy Matters, a podcast series by TajRupt.
Hi everyone, my name is Firuzjon Sodikov. I'm a project coordinator at TajRupt. Welcome to the first episode of Democracy Matters podcast. Today we have a special guest, Azizjon Azimi, the chairman and the founder of TajRupt. We are going to talk about the Eurasian Economic Union. So with the first question we go, what's the story behind Eurasian Economic Union? What are the results so far?
Hey everybody, thank you very much for that introduction, Firuzjon. It's a great feeling to be recording this podcast, which is kind of pioneering in our context, and I really look forward to contributing to this podcast in the future as well. Well, Eurasian Economic Union is a grandiose project. It's been there for over 2 decades, and a lot of pundits, a lot of experts talk about it. And if you look at the story of the Eurasian Union, the narrative goes that the godfather of the idea for Eurasian Union was Kazakh President Nursultan Nazarbayev. In 1994, he floated the idea for creating a post-Soviet union that would bring together the economic policies of former Soviet countries. And over the years, as expected, it became a priority in Russian foreign policy, especially before President Putin's third term. In 2011, I remember back in October, November, when he announced his candidacy for the presidency and he was writing his policy papers in different Russian newspapers, he even dedicated a special article to the issue of Eurasian Union. The precursor to the Eurasian Union was the customs union that was formed by Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan in 2010. And the way the process works is that you first have a customs union, which means there are no intra-country barriers or tariffs, so they exempted each other from tariffs. And at the same time, they implemented the same tariff policy for external goods. So all three countries adopted the same tariff percentages for goods that are coming into any of the three countries from abroad. The next logical step was the signing of the Astana Treaty in May 2014, when the countries really formed the Eurasian Union. And today there are 5 countries in the Union. It's Russia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Belarus. And there's a lot of debate and speculation going on about what is the real power and what is the real intention and goal behind the creation of the Union. Is it for it to be a restoration of the Soviet Union or a reformed version of the European Union? And I hope we're going to get to discuss more about this.
It's really interesting to hear your thoughts about it, but I wanted to note that usually grand projects like this come by Russia, Russia offers this kind of projects. But however, in this case, we have a project initiator as a Kazakhstan. And it seems that these 3 countries like Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia are really intended to spreading this project and enlarging it. And as we see in the result, Armenia and Kyrgyzstan joined the economic union recently. And it is seen that other countries are showing their interest on joining the union. And it was informed that Vietnam already signed the free trade agreement with the union. Since it is already existing 2 years already, I wanted to know what other countries are already showing the interest to join the union, and are there any project implementation by the founders of the union to accept those countries to the union?
I think one thing that's important to note is that if you look at an overview of the Eurasian Union up to date, the fundamentals are very weak. What I mean by that is the structure of the institutions that have been created have been intergovernmental as opposed to supranational. So, for instance, European Union has a set of supranational bodies like the European Commission that oversee the implementation of common policies in economics, politics, and security. Eurasian Union from the beginning, from the Astana Treaty that was signed in 2014, if you look at the context, it was after Russia annexed Crimea. It was after the war in Donbass began, and the members that joined Russia in the Union were very wary of Russia's long-term intentions. But I myself, the way I view political thinking, political theory, is that I don't view it as a state-based interaction. I view it as a person-based interaction. I'm a follower of the selector theory that says that, for instance, there's no such thing as national interest. National interest is defined by those who are in power. And the only difference is that, there are different limitations and constraints on power. In Russia, Vladimir Putin wants to have absolute power. In the United States, Donald Trump wants to get reelected in 2020. So democracies are different from authoritarian regimes based on the institutions and the power distribution. Now, the Eurasian Union in and of itself doesn't have a full democracy, right? All countries are authoritarian, maybe with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, which is a quasi-democracy. But if you look into the way the issues have been addressed, for instance, in 2014, when the union came to existence, until today, there still has not been harmonization of non-tariff barriers. So, for example, the members have talked a lot about standardizing their financial regulation policies. Still hasn't happened. They have talked about creating a common market for electricity and energy. Still hasn't happened. And that shows you that this project, the intention behind it, isn't really serious. Now, what I mean by serious is that from the beginning, if you look at the ascension of Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, this has been a Russia-dominated union, right? This has been a clear project that Vladimir Putin has invested his time in. So Kazakhstan might have been the side, Nazarbayev might have been the one who actually came up with the idea of the union, but the real driver behind the day-to-day policy has been Russia. And for Russia, one fact that I think is very important to highlight is that this is more of a political rather than economic union, because the trade with Eurasian Union countries accounts for only 5% of Russia's trade. Russia trades far more with Europeans than with countries that are part of the Eurasian Union. So that really showcases to you that Russia has enlarged the Eurasian Union into Armenia and Kyrgyzstan largely by intergovernmental work, by bilateral relations. It hasn't been that Armenia and Kyrgyzstan have been so eager to join. The example of Armenia is very clear, right? In 2013, Armenia was about to sign the association agreement with the European Union, just as Ukraine, and Putin visited Yerevan. And suddenly, President Sargsyan made a U-turn in September 2013 and announced that Armenia wouldn't be pursuing further talks at the time and would instead join the Eurasian Union. Everybody wasn't surprised, the public, the elites, but this showcased how, because the regimes are authoritarian and Russia wanted to play a game where more members would join, showcasing the growing power of the regime and the country in the international arena, it used its economic tools to, so to say, bribe them in. And what are the tools that Russia uses, right? Energy. They use their gas prices. Belarus depends on cheap Russian gas to sustain its economy. And given the economic crisis that's been going on in Belarus, it's vital for them to remain in the union just for the sake of low energy prices. Other instances like Armenia or Kyrgyzstan include Russia giving out subsidized loans to countries. This is a Russia-dominated union that has very little implementation and a lot of political narrative behind it, which I think is a core structural issue. What I wanted to get your input on is you currently living in Tajikistan, right? Tajikistan is at the crossroads of deciding whether it will join the union or not. And discussions have been going on both governmental and expert level for a couple of years. As a citizen of the country that has almost half of its GDP coming from migrant remittances from Russia and other CIS countries, how do you personally view joining the Eurasian Union and the prospects of it for citizens?
First of all, I want to say that from your thoughts, it seems that the union, like its economic goals, are only on paper, but the main reasons for joining for each member, like starting from Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, or Belarus, are different. And this worries me as a citizen of Tajikistan who is in a process where need to make a choice, either to join the union or leave it as it is right now. It has been a lot of debate in Tajikistan on whether joining or no, but from my point of view, Tajikistan should think like twice or many times before joining it, because as we're seeing right now, after existing of the union like for 2 years, yes, there is some economic progress, but there are a lot of disagreements between the member states, which does not help them to develop economically. Instead, they have like, each state has like different political motivation. For Kyrgyzstan, it's like having good conditions for its migrants. For Armenia, it's like a security guarantees that in case something happens in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenia will be safe, like, and backed by Russia. And Belarus, as you said, it's like resources in terms of gas. And for Kazakhstan, at first it seems that Kazakhstan wanted to transfer, to develop its like trade with other member states, but it seems that the Kazakhstan itself like are hurting from the joining it, because as the financial crisis happened and the ruble was down, like really cheap Russian products were flooding to Kazakhstan market, and the competition among the goods within Kazakhstan was very high because there were a lot of cheap products from Russia, while Kazakhstan could not sell its goods for the same price as Russian goods. The point with this is that like Tajikistan is now just developing and starting like own production, and in some cases we have like goods that are more expensive than Russians, even though the quality may differ. So in case Tajikistan will join and there will be the same thing as in Kazakhstan market, so we will get a lot of products from Kazakhstan, Russia and Belarus, our goods cannot compete and we can lose some percentage of our production, like home production.
Right.
So I think that there should still be like some discussion and we might look into some other alternative. For example, not like directly joining the union. We're like a partner of the Eurasian Economic Union.
I think you raised a very good point with how the devaluation of ruble after the drop in oil prices has negatively impacted the members of the union. Another side of that is, what is the incentive for a country like Kyrgyzstan to join the union? Or like Tajikistan? The biggest incentive is the easing of labor restrictions, right? For instance, if a Kyrgyz citizen goes to Russia today, now that Kyrgyzstan is part of the Eurasian Union, the Kyrgyz citizens don't need to get patents, to start their employment. Tajik citizens, on the other hand, have to spend thousands of rubles to get patents and to continuously, pay these patents on a permanent basis when they're employed in Russia, if they're in legal sector. And otherwise, they have to go through Russian language examinations and other, so to say, barriers and restrictions to labor, finding employment, foreign labor in Russia. So Russia has used, the policy of carrots and said to the former Soviet Union countries in Central Asia, look, we know that you guys are dependent on our economy for your development, right? Kyrgyzstan is very similar structurally to the economy of Tajikistan, right? About a third of Kyrgyzstan's GDP comes from migrant remittances. But at the same time, what really has changed the narrative, besides the situation in Ukraine, as kind of a quasi-consequence of the situation in Ukraine, is the economic downturn in Russia. Now, the majority of it was obviously because of the drop in oil prices that has led to economic downward trend in Russia, but also the devaluation of ruble and international sanctions that have been implemented by the West. Because Russia's economy contracted by about 3.7% in 2015, that has directly impacted in a negative way the economies of other Eurasian Union members. For example, Kyrgyzstan, right? The economic growth slowed down because there was a stark decrease in remittances. Tajikistan, not being a member of the Union, already faces an economic crisis because migrants can't send the same amount of money that they used to before. So on one hand, if Tajikistan were to join the Eurasian Union, the positive would be that our citizens would have more disposable income. They wouldn't spend money on patents, on language examinations. They would have more income to send back home. But on the other hand, this would basically institutionalize the current structure of Tajik economy, whereby half of the GDP comes from migrant remittances from abroad. So we are making, a kind of a decision between the lesser of two evils, right? Where we either allow the economy to become perpetually remittance-based, and we, overlook long-term structural reforms inside the country, or we, on the other hand, find short-term tactical success in allowing our citizens to go abroad and find employment, but in the long-term strategy, we'll lose our, so to say, economic sovereignty in a way, right? And there was a great research paper that I came across that on the Eurasian Union. It was called Deals, Rules, and the Excess of Power by Rilka Dragneva and Katerina Volchuk as part of the Russian Eurasia program. It was released just in May 2017. And they do mention, the case of Kazakhstan, where because the country just recently joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, it has failed to adapt the same tariff policies that the Union has, the other Union countries have. As we know, for example, it's a matter of fact that Russia has had protectionist policies, tariff policies under Vladimir Putin. So when the customs union came into effect in 2010, Kazakhstan and Belarus had to actually increase their tariffs to match Russia's level because, again, they needed to harmonize their tariff policies. And since then, because Kazakhstan joined WTO, it had to adopt different policies because as part of WTO, it couldn't adopt the same high tariff policies that were implemented as part of the union. So actually what happened was Kazakhstan got an exemption to harmonize its policies until 2022, I think, and Kyrgyzstan also got an extension until 2020. Now, so this shows you how structurally the union is very weak. Economically, it's very weak. The intra-Eurasian Union trade in 2015, the year that the crisis happened in Russia, slowed down. It decreased to meager levels. So again, more and more, even if you look at the structure, right, you have the Supreme Council of Heads of States, then you have a special structure where heads of governments meet, and then you have more low-level expert, technocratic bodies within the Eurasian Union, but all of them depend on the political will of the Supreme Council, which is made up of heads of state. So this is again a vertical of power kind of ruling where all the decisions are political and they all have to be coordinated to make sure that they bring short-term domestic political success to the leaders of these countries. So that's why I think it's not a structurally viable path for the union to sustain. It might sustain because of Russia's military prowess, its political pressure, but purely on economic terms, the union isn't really very attractive for other members to join at the moment, I think.
And I wanted to note that how Tajikistan can join while countries like Russia is trying to play cards with Tajikistan, forcing it to join. For example, the migration policy. Sometimes there were cases when there were raids on Tajik migrants. They were caught and sent back to the country. So I think by this way, Russia is trying to force Tajikistan to fasten the process of joining the union. But yes, there will be a lot of benefits for our migrants, but how we can join a union where the member states play on cards and trying to get the countries by using their forces, in case of migrant policy. And the other important thing is that some countries were joined to the union by promises and by offers that Russia gave them, in case of Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. The thing is that as long as Russia keeps giving those promises and offers to the member states, they will be there. Let's imagine that in some case of point there will be some, financial crisis or slowdown of economy where Russia will be unable to provide those guarantees that it were given before the joining the union. So it might split the union in one moment. For example, we know the president of Belarus, he's very charismatic.
That's a great characterization.
In one case, he's saying that Russia is our brother. In other case, when the Russian authorities ban Belarusian meat to the Russian market, he's announcing that we're gonna look for oil resources to other countries like Iran or something, and we can stop our membership in the union. The same thing about Kazakhstan when in 2014 the Russian Federation annexed Crimea. Nazarbayev, even though he did not protest against this action, but he stood firmly that in case any action will be taken against Kazakhstan's sovereignty, Kazakhstan keeps the right to, rephrasing his words, keeps the right to stop its membership in the union. Why it's happened? Because Russia argued its annexation on Crimea because it was defending the Russians, right? But we know that there are a lot of Russians who live in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan worries that some precedents might happen in Kazakhstan because you don't know what's going to happen in the world politics or the regional politics.
Exactly. And I think you mentioned the fact that Russian guarantees are very volatile, both in terms of investment as well as political guarantees. I think Tajikistan has really felt it firsthand. What Russia has in this situation is really a carte blanche, right? Russia has significantly more influence on Tajikistan than it does on, for instance, other members of the union. And the reason is because, first and foremost, Russia has a military base in Tajikistan, the 201st military base. Besides the migrant issue, is, for instance, the harmonization of the financial services industry, right? So if Tajikistan were to join the Eurasian Union, at its core, we would be expected to adopt the same financial standards that are obviously much higher in Russia and other countries than in our country. So that would present competition to our local banks that have obviously not fared very well in the economic crisis. So I don't think those are necessarily bad things, because adopting higher financial standards is an absolute must for the country, given the current circumstances. But I think this is more about strategic, long-term practices and long-term intentions. If we were to achieve and if we strive for long-term structural reform across all sectors, across all domains, this would be a bad decision for the future generations. Because obviously we can leave the union at any time, right? But at the same time, once you are in the union and if you want to exit it, it's not very easy to do because Russia has a lot of influence and a lot of pressure mechanisms. That's why the countries that have joined already, Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, it's almost impossible for them to leave because the political costs for the leaders of those countries are too high. So I think to be prudent, a prudent approach would be what you're saying, which is to try to negotiate bilateral relations with Russia in terms of easing the requirements for Tajik migrants, as well as adopting higher financial standards on our own, but joining the Eurasian Economic Union with its weak institutions, with its weak enforcement, with its almost non-existent harmonization of economic policy would be a grave mistake for the future.
And at the same time, we should note, like, since right now it's a process for Tajikistan to choose or not to choose to join the union, there are a lot of talks among the citizens since there is a variety of access on Russian TV in Tajikistan, and mostly the migrants, for example, our migrants go to Russia and they see the differences. They see that they need to take a long process of documentation just to get the license or just to get the patent and or pass an exam. But they see the Kyrgyz migrant, right, and see that how easy it is for them. So I'm afraid that this influence will kind of force our government to join the union, because when the citizens kind of without knowing that what they are joining in real, they might force the government to make a decision in favor of joining the union. So this problem worries me a lot, because I told already that we should be very careful on joining the union, but at the same time we should have like a process of explaining to our citizens like why we are thinking about it, why it is important to think twice before joining the union. So the migrants and the other parts of the citizens can understand this.
Yeah, and I think it's very important because this is part of a far-reaching Russian agenda. I don't necessarily agree that this is a restoration of the Soviet Union, because if you go back to the selector theory, political leaders, right, would never, the current political leaders of Eurasian Union members would not sacrifice their own power for the sake of a restored version of the Soviet Union. I don't even think Vladimir Putin is interested in restoring the Soviet Union. It's not in his political benefit. This is all about power durability, right? There are a lot of grandiose words, grand narratives that have been pushed, but at the end of the day, this is all about leaders in these countries keeping their power. And Vladimir Putin, to keep his power in Russia, he doesn't need to restore the Soviet Union. He doesn't have an incentive to do so. Russian citizens, with the growth of nationalism that we've seen over the past decade or so, aren't really keen on having Tajiks or Kyrgyz as equal citizens in their country. So I really don't think this is a long-term plan of Russia to restore the Soviet Union. But at the same time, this is also not a reformed version of the European Union, because the European Union had a clear process, a clear enforcement mechanism to implement the laws that were adopted by the member states. Eurasian Union doesn't have that, right? The core of the Eurasian Union is practically very weak, and the enforcement of the laws has been more intergovernmental as opposed to supranational. So unless there is strong enforcement of reducing non-trade barriers or adopting same economic policy, we're not going to see the effective results. So for countries in the region, this is all about gaining short-term political advantage from the Putin regime to sustain themselves and to continue their hold on power. So I think this is very important to realize that tactical success is not necessarily long-term victory. So the Eurasian Union, as stable as it seems today, at its core, it's fundamentally weak, and its prospects are also, in my opinion, very bleak for the coming years.
Yeah, it's not a really happy story when we hear that the union has a good structure and it can progress in the future. But at the same time, we should note that the region itself should have something like the union, which will allow the countries to develop their economy, so there will be better exchange of goods, services, and like people can easily travel from one place to another place. Lately, there were some scholars who were saying that maybe like Central Asian countries like should form something like a union that will allow them to trade with Russia on equal rights, rather than being just a member of Russian club and not playing the same rules. Because in the Eurasian Economic Union, I don't completely believe that the rules are fair for everyone.
Right.
Because not just the papers play a great role, but the power, for example, like military power or like economic advantage, more developed economy plays a big role on the union.
Right, exactly, and I definitely agree with you on that. And I think, just to put a final note on this, we need to realize that countries within Central Asia, if there were to be a strong supranational economic body that would coordinate the economic policies of our countries, that would be advantageous to all members economically. Look at example of Nafta, right? United States, Canada, and Mexico. Mexico and the United States have different levels of economic development, but overall, both countries have benefited, including Canada. All three countries have benefited over the past 2 decades, despite the rhetoric that we see from President Trump. Numbers don't lie. Economics is very precise and accurate, and it tells you that free trade is net good for an economy. So if Central Asian countries, and even Russia, right, with the advent of Russia, if there were to be a true economic union where all members would have real economic sovereignty, but also the union would be enforceable, meaning that it would enforce the laws, it would root out non-tariff barriers between the countries, it would really harmonize the standards for technical work. This would be beneficial for all countries in the region. We share a common history, right, whether we like it or not. Majority of population in these countries still speak Russian. Russian is often an everyday language in these countries. But it's just the leaders of the countries chose purposely to start on the wrong fundamentals, which was to continue their hold on power as opposed to enforce accountability. Remember, keep in mind that European Union, with the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, it adopted its supranational bodies on the premise of democracy, of transparency, of accountability of institutions. All of those systemically lack in the Eurasian Union. And Eurasian Union bodies don't even call for implementation of accountability. The example of the Astana Treaty is a clear showcase of that. In the beginning, there was a lot of supranational talk, right? But with the situation in Ukraine, the other countries, the other political leaders became a little bit wary for their political standing and their sovereignty in terms of their own advantage and benefit. So they took out the language from the Astana Treaty on supranational bodies, right? Instead of supranational, we saw the words intergovernmental. The Eurasian Union court rulings would not supersede national laws or would not create national laws, right? These are words and these are terms that clearly show how politics has taken the place of economics in this union. And I think that's why we need to be very careful. So to kind of sum this up, we're seeing a short-term political entity that serves the political goals of the leaders who are currently in power. So our prospects for Tajikistan, if we do really want to have development across all segments of society, we need to look into this from a perspective of the long-term strategic results. And in terms of long-term strategic results, this is not beneficial for us. So we were much better off by starting by being the initiators of change, by being the initiators of accountability, of transparency in the region. And that is why it's important on us, on our citizens, to realize that. And we've been doing a lot of work in TajRupt on promoting civic education. And one aspect of that is educating citizens about their rights and their knowledge and familiarity with foreign policy. So this is what I hope we'll have to talk more about at TajRupt as well. And our students will put their contribution to research and analysis in terms of ascension to the Eurasian Union. Realize the true potential of the region through fair and real enforceable economic unions.
All right, thank you for great thoughts. And I wanted to stress one thing, that it is better and quicker if the heads of the government and the countries in the region think about the points that we noted, because if the process will not go fast. There would be other options, like other projects, for example, like agitating by China, like Silk Road project, that might push Eurasian Economic Union and end its existence, because if you don't play a good game, the members or the future members will not going to join it. So thank you very much. It was episode 1, Democracy Matters by TajRupt. Thank you, Azizjon Azimi. We had a guest, the chairman and the founder of TajRupt. Thank you.
Thank you very much.